It was mid-April 1862. Union Major General Ulysses S. Grant is fresh off resounding victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. He's feeling confident, perhaps even cocky. The Civil War had just rolled into its second year. Tens of thousands of men from both sides had been killed, wounded, or captured. Until then, General Grant believed the Southern rebellion against the United States would have collapsed by now. He and the rest of the North felt they only needed one decisive victory. However, none had seen fighting so brutal, so carnal, as what they witnessed between April 6th and April 7th, 1862. Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston had just withdrawn from Kentucky, allowing Grant to capture crucial points en route to Mississippi. The first was Nashville, a crucial supply depot and industrial center for the Confederate Army. From there, Grant could deploy federal troops into the Tennessee River, shipping them south to capture the city of Corinth, Mississippi. Grant wanted Corinth more than anything. Meanwhile, Confederate troops would give anything to defend it. Corinth was a crucial railroad junction when river and rail were the primary means of transportation. It straddled the Mobile, Ohio line, which bisected the Memphis-Charleston line. Memphis-Charleston was the only railroad connecting the Mississippi River to the Atlantic Ocean at the time. Controlling this railroad meant controlling the war. Over 100,000 men met on a battlefield near the Shiloh Meeting House, a hewn log church that lent its name to the bloodiest battle the war had seen thus far. Coincidentally, the word Shiloh is a Hebrew expression meaning place of peace. In reality, the land between the church and the river was turned into a field of mud and blood. Nearly 24,000 men perished between 2 days of brutal fighting. Many of them died in the meat grinder known as the Hornet's Nest, where a brave band of Union fighters held out as long as they could against an onslaught of Confederate bullets and artillery. Their fight gave General Grant the time he needed to reorganize his army and launch a massive counterattack the following day. Their bravery in the face of death turned the tide of war. This is the story of Shiloh and the Hornet's Nest, one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on the American continent. For many Union men, springtime in Tennessee was unlike any they'd ever seen. General Grant had stationed them at Pittsburgh Landing, a strategic location on the banks of the Tennessee River about 22 miles north of Corinth. Roughly 40,000 Union men made camp in open fields. They enjoyed themselves in the southern sunshine, rolling up their pants and shirt sleeves and walking barefoot through the warm grass. It was peaceful and picturesque. Birds sang in the trees above a forest floor carpeted by violets. Yet war weighed heavy on their minds. Grant was ordered to hold position and wait for Major General Don Carlos Buell. He was marching south with 30,000 more men. Once both armies convened, they'd begin their assault on Corinth, taking it with sheer numbers. Meanwhile, Confederate General Johnston and his 44,000-man army of the Mississippi had a decision to make. General Buell was several days away. If they left Corinth now, they could launch a surprise attack on Grant's men and cripple them before reinforcements arrived. But Johnston was also waiting for another 14,000 men of his own. Instead of marching on Grant, he could hold in Corinth and attempt to stave off the assault. His senior subordinate, General P.G.T. Beauregard, a decorated military commander known for his victories at Fort Sumter and Bull Run, convinced him to attack. They marched out on April 2nd, hoping to end the battle before it even began. Unfortunately, Mother Nature had other ideas. Relentless rain turned the dirt roads into sludge and delayed their march. Entire regiments became lost in the bog, ending up miles away from the rendezvous when the storm cleared. By dawn on April 5th, Johnston's army was so disorganized that he was forced to delay the attack. Now, Beauregard was having second thoughts. The Union Army had surely seen them or at least heard them marching. Instead of being caught with their pants down, the Yankees would be entrenched up to their eyes. Little did he know Grant's men were camped in open fields like Boy Scouts. Meanwhile, their leader was 9 miles upriver at a mansion in Savannah, Tennessee. The Union Army couldn't be more vulnerable. Beauregard urged Johnston to turn around and retreat to Corinth, but Johnston was determined, declaring, "Gentlemen, we will attack at daylight." Skirmishes had broken out on the night of April 5th. Messengers from forward Union camps raced back to General William Sherman, who was in charge while Grant was away. But Sherman didn't believe them. In fact, he threatened to arrest them for spreading misinformation. He and Grant were so confident that Johnston wouldn't attack that they ordered the men not to fortify their positions. Fighting broke out around 5 a.m. on Sunday, April 6th. The first official shots at Shiloh were likely fired by a Union patrol who discovered Confederate skirmishes lurking on the outskirts of Sherman's camp. Meanwhile, everyone else was eating breakfast and beginning their morning camp duties. That's when the roll of drums called them to arms. By 7 a.m., Confederate lines began marching from the woods, shouting the haunting rebel yell as they steamrolled Union camps. And yet Sherman remained unconvinced that an attack was even happening. It was only after his orderly was killed and Sherman himself was shot in the hand that he turned and screamed, "My God, we are attacked!" Johnston's army moved like an organized parade. Regiment after regiment emerged from the tree line as their musicians played Dixie. The rebel yell echoed from tens of thousands of throats. Some say the yell was so loud that it overpowered the music and gunfire. Meanwhile, Sherman's men were disorganized and undefended. Many had never seen battle, and some had just gotten their guns the day before. Historians estimate that 10,000 of them fled and hid under the bluffs by the river. By 11 a.m. on the 6th, the Confederate assault had successfully routed 3 Union divisions. Nearly 2/3 of Union ground strength retreated toward Pittsburgh Landing. Grant was eating breakfast at the mansion when he heard cannon fire in the distance. He rushed to the battlefield by steamboat, arriving around 9 a.m., but there was little he could do at this point. His best option was to fall back, reorganize, and wait for Buell's men. Hopefully, they weren't far. But by midday on April 6th, the pendulum was swinging out of General Johnston's favor. His original plan was to push Grant's right flank northwestward toward the snake-infested swamps. He, however, drove them due north, directly toward Pittsburgh Landing. This allowed Grant to keep his army together and prevented Johnston from breaking the line. Johnston received word that a Tennessee brigade was refusing to fight. They were scared and without strong leadership. So Johnston himself took command and led the charge against Union troops at the Peach Orchard. He took it easily and was riding back toward his army when he felt something wet in his boot. Johnston had been shot in the knee. The bullet severed an artery and he was bleeding like a stuck pig. He hadn't noticed during the battle. Historians say Johnston had injured the same leg in a duel several years prior. It was numb most of the time, so he never felt the bullet strike him. A doctor could have saved him, but Johnston had sent his own doctor away to help wounded Yankee soldiers. He bled to death around 2:45 p.m. Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston was the highest-ranking officer killed on either side during the American Civil War. Upon General Johnston's death, command of the Confederate Army shifted to General Beauregard. This gave Grant more time to regroup as Southern command structures tried to reorganize as quickly as possible. There seemed to be some confusion regarding which direction Johnston wanted to push the Union Army before he died, into the Tennessee River or away from the river. At this point, the battlefield was divided into 3 critical pieces. To the Confederate right and Union left, you had the Peach Orchard, which Johnston had successfully taken before being shot in the leg. About 1/3 of the Confederate Army focused on that position. Meanwhile, on the Confederate left and the Union right, you had the crossroads, where General Sherman's men were forced to retreat and regroup. Roughly 2/3 of the Confederate Army concentrated on this position. In the middle, you have Union Generals Benjamin Prentiss and William Wallace with their respective men, a patchwork of 3 regiments numbering roughly 6,500 men on the line and 3,000 in reserve. As the Union flanks retreated, Prentiss and Wallace were left to defend their position in the middle. It was a 600-yard stretch of overgrown land covered in thick, impenetrable brush. An old wagon trail split the brush down the middle. This trail became known as the Sunken Road, as portions sank several inches from decades of heavy traffic. The Confederates set their sights on the Sunken Road as the Union right and left flanks began retreating. They sent wave after wave into the thicket, only to be peppered with bullets and cannon fire from an enemy they couldn't see. The undergrowth was so dense that all they could see were muzzle flashes and smoke rising from Union barrels. The sound of bullets zipping over their heads reminded them of angry hornets, they began calling this place the Hornet's Nest. Confederate forces were outnumbered at first, but as the Union flanks collapsed, the sound of gunfire attracted Southern regiments from the east and west. By 4 p.m. on April 6th, Generals Prentiss and Wallace were surrounded inside the Hornet's Nest. They had no choice but to surrender. The Confederate Army captured General Prentiss and roughly 2,200 Union fighters. Wallace helped his men escape the Hornet's Nest but was mortally wounded and died on the battlefield. It was a valiant effort but a crushing defeat. But wars are not won in a day. Night fell on the 6th of April. The Union stand at the Hornet's Nest brought General Grant another day to reorganize and plan a counterattack. More importantly, it brought General Buell more time to arrive with reinforcements. He made it before sundown, just as Grant was stationing siege cannons on his newly formed front line. These weapons were meant to subdue Corinth. Now they were repelling any semblance of a Confederate attack. Grant watched as his monstrous guns forced the Southerners back. It's said that a rebel cannonball passed within 10 feet of Grant and obliterated the head of one of his aides. General Beauregard decided to halt the nighttime attack as another rainstorm moved in. He wrongly believed that Grant's reinforcements weren't coming. In fact, he sent a dispatch to Richmond proclaiming victory at Shiloh. He slept that night, believing he'd easily mop up the rest of Grant's army in the morning. Beauregard awoke to the thunderous sound of footsteps and gunfire. Grant had organized a surprise counterattack and rushed the Confederate line. He had 40,000 men at his disposal, half of which were battle fresh. Meanwhile, Beauregard's forces numbered about 28,000. Bolstered by Buell's men, Grant steamrolled the remaining rebel forces. Beauregard put up a solid yet fruitless defense. When he realized the battle was lost, Beauregard ordered his men back to Corinth, Mississippi. Grant's counterattack on the second day of Shiloh is among the most critical reversals during the Civil War. Grant chooses to rest as he and his entire army are weary from 2 days of battle. Over 110,000 men met on the battlefield over 48 hours. Nearly 24,000 were dead, wounded, or missing. 2 days of fighting produced more casualties than all previous wars fought by the United States combined. It was the bloodiest battle to ever take place in the Western Hemisphere up to that point. Back home, Grant was criticized and vilified after news of Shiloh spread. Many questioned why the Union Army was unprepared and why Grant wasn't there when the battle broke out. Even though Grant won, his critics wanted to know why he didn't pursue Beauregard's retreating forces. They accused him of indifference, sloth, and drunkenness. According to legend, when his critics accused Grant of drunkenness, Abraham Lincoln famously said, "Then find out what kind of whiskey he drinks and send a barrel to my other generals." On May 30th, Union troops finally arrived in Corinth to find the city abandoned. Over the next 3 months, the Union Navy took New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and Memphis. Grant went on to lead the siege of Vicksburg on July 4, 1863, capturing nearly 30,000 rebel troops. By then, the conflict had devolved into a grueling war of attrition. Confederate President Jefferson Davis could never fill the void left by General Johnston's death. He called the general's death the turning point of our fate. Today, over 5,000 acres have been preserved to honor those who fell at Shiloh. Sites including Pittsburgh Landing, the Bloody Pond, and the Hornet's Nest are all part of the Shiloh National Military Park. The Shiloh Church that stands today is a near exact replica of the building that stood over 150 years ago. It's been rebuilt and refurbished with centuries-old timber to preserve the aesthetic. The military park is finally a place of peace.